would clean the floor and be quiet, mocked the millionaire CEO at the cleaner. Certain she was insignificant, he and his partner openly discussed the details of a millionaire fraud, laughing at the situation. They just didn't notice one detail. The woman, instead of lowering her head, looked at the millionaire and smiled. At that exact moment, the door to the room opened. The true owner of the company entered, ignored the CEO and his partner, looked directly at the cleaner, and asked something that would change the course of those in the room forever. The top of the world, for Owen Sterling Jr., smelled of Italian leather, freshly polished mahogany, and the rarefied air of power. From the window of his corner office in the Sterling Logistics Tower, New York City stretched out at his feet, a glittering model of light and ambition, as small and insignificant as most of the people who inhabited it. He felt like a god on his Olympus of glass and steel, a skyscraper that pierced the clouds over the East River. Beside him, Frank Costello, his partner and the financial architect of his most daring ambitions, chewed his nails, a nervous counterpoint to Owen's predatory calm. The boardroom table, a massive slab of dark wood, reflected their distorted faces, accomplices in a plan that would make them not just rich, but legendary. They were finalizing the details of a masterpiece of financial engineering, a capital diversion that would bleed the company subtly, yet devastatingly, transferring a fortune to the tax haven of their accounts in the Cayman Islands. The blame, the masterstroke, would fall on the board of directors, conveniently absent on a business trip arranged by them. The plan was perfect, a symphony of numbers and lies. In the midst of their discussion about transfer dates and the forgery of digital signatures, a nearly imperceptible sound broke their concentration. The service door opened, and Elisa Morales, the night shift cleaning lady, entered pushing her cleaning cart. She was a figure who blended into the furniture, a shadow in a grey uniform who moved through the corners of power without ever touching it. Frank fell silent instantly, his body as taut as a violin string. His eyes, wide and frightened, followed the woman as she began to empty the trash from the chrome wastebaskets. Owen, however, let out a low laugh, a sound of pure disdain that echoed in the tense silence. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk of superiority playing on his lips. "Relax, Frank," he said, his voice slick with arrogance. "Don't worry about her. She's illiterate, dumb as a post. She doesn't understand a single thing we're saying." To prove his point, and perhaps to show off for his partner, he turned to Elisa, who had her back to them, mopping the floor near the bookshelf. "Hey, you! Clean up and be quiet, will you? Don't interrupt the adults' conversation." Frank forced a laugh, still uncomfortable, but Owen's confidence was contagious. They resumed their conversation, now without the slightest care. Believing Elisa to be an invisible, deaf piece of furniture, they openly detailed the amounts, the names of the banks, the access passwords. They mocked her presence as they discussed the division of the profits, the purchase of assets abroad, and how they would celebrate the success of their heist. Owen gesticulated, animated, the adrenaline of power and transgression coursing through his veins. He felt untouchable, the master of a universe he had created. It was then that the subtle movement occurred. Elisa, still with her back to them, stopped mopping the floor. The mop stood motionless in her hand. Slowly, as if in a thriller, she turned. Her face, once a mask of neutrality, was now a study in cold calculation. She looked directly into Owen's eyes, and a smile formed on her lips. It was not a smile of sympathy or submission. It was an icy, cutting smile that made Owen's blood run cold for an instant. The insolence of that look unsettled him, a dissonant note in his symphony of control. At that exact moment, as if timed by an unseen force, the double doors to the executive suite burst open. The imposing figure of Arthur Sterling, the Patriarch D, the true owner of the company everyone believed to be on a prolonged medical leave in Europe, filled the doorway. He was older, his hair whiter, but his eyes held the same steely intensity as always. Flanked by two tall men in dark suits with the rigid posture of federal agents, he advanced into the room. Owen and Frank leaped to their feet, panic rising in their throats. Owen stammered, trying to form a greeting, an excuse, anything. But Arthur didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on a single person. He walked with firm, deliberate steps, ignoring the table, the partners, and the luxury of the office, and stopped directly in front of Elisa. She didn't move, holding the old patriarch's gaze. With a calm, almost theatrical gesture, she lifted the collar of her grey uniform, revealing the thin wire of a microphone and the small dot of an electronic bug taped to her skin. The owner of the company looked at her, and his voice, firm and loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, cut through the air like a blade. "Did you get everything?" Elisa straightened her uniform, the cold smile still on her lips, and answered with a crystal clarity that sealed the fate of the two men who had humiliated her. "Every word, sir." The sound of Elisa's words, "Every word, sir," hung in the conditioned air of the room like a death sentence. For Owen, the world seemed to contract, the vast panoramic office shrinking into a claustrophobic cell. Her smile, once an insignificant detail on a servant's face, was now the image of his personal apocalypse. The woman he had called dumb as a post was, in fact, the door slamming shut forever on his life of luxury and power. The echo of his own arrogant, disdainful voice returned to haunt him, each syllable a shovelful of dirt on his coffin. He looked at Frank, hoping to find a pillar of complicity, but found only the wreckage of a man. Frank was waxen pale, his lips trembling, his eyes fixed on nothing, as if his soul had already fled his body to escape the impending disaster. The vast fortune they had planned to embezzle, all that capital that represented absolute freedom, had turned to dust before their eyes. The two FBI agents moved with silent, lethal efficiency. There were no shouts, no violence, just the final, metallic click of handcuffs closing around Frank's wrists. He collapsed into the nearest leather chair, a stringless puppet. He began to babble incoherently about his wife, his kids, the mortgage on their Hamptons beach house. Owen, on the other hand, remained standing, paralyzed by a mixture of disbelief and impotent rage. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny, to use the power of his name and fortune, but the words died in his throat. What argument could he use against the recorded truth? Mr. Sterling walked slowly to the window, turning his back on the chaos. He watched the city below, the lights beginning to flicker in the twilight. "The fall of great empires always begins with an excess of confidence," he said, more to himself than to the others. Then he turned, and his eyes, cold as steel, locked onto Owen. "You didn't just try to steal money from this company. You dishonored the Sterling name. You betrayed the trust I placed in you, my own nephew." The revelation of their kinship made the betrayal even more bitter. Owen felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He wasn't just a CEO, he was family, and his greed had led him to betray the man who had given him everything. As one of the agents pulled Frank to his feet, Elisa acted with unnerving calm. She carefully removed the small microphone from her collar and disconnected the wire from a tiny transmitter hidden beneath her uniform. She handed the equipment to Arthur with the casualness of someone submitting a routine report. Her movements were methodical, her eyes focused on the task, completely ignoring the drama of the two men whose ruin she had just engineered. For her, this didn't seem like a personal victory, but the fulfillment of a sacred duty. Justice, for Elisa, was not a spectacle. It was a silent, inevitable process. As he was led toward the door, Owen's wounded pride gave way to a searing question that burned in his mind. The fraud, the money, the prison, all of it became secondary to the mystery of this woman. He stopped, pulling against the agent's arm, and turned his face to her. His voice was a hoarse whisper, heavy with despair and confusion. "You, who are you?" "Really?" The agent tried to pull him away, but Arthur raised a hand, granting him this last moment. Elisa just watched him, her face a blank, unreadable canvas. It was Arthur who answered, his voice resonating with the weight of history and secrets. He took a step forward, subtly placing himself between Owen and Elisa like a guardian. "She, my dear nephew," the old patriarch said, with a tone that mixed sorrow and a strange kind of pride. "It was the person you never bothered to see, and as of today, she is the true guardian of the legacy you tried to destroy." The door clicked shut, muffling Owen's distant protests and Frank's choked sobs. In the presidential suite, the ensuing silence was dense, heavy with the ghost of the events that had just unfolded. Elisa remained motionless for a long moment, the hum of adrenaline in her ears beginning to fade. She looked at her own hands, a cleaner's hands, calloused from daily labor, and saw in them the instrument of an implacable justice. She felt no euphoria, no sweet taste of revenge, only the deep exhaustion of a long, silent battle that had finally ended. Mr. Sterling let out a sigh, the sound of a man who had carried a heavy burden for too long. He approached her, his slow steps echoing on the polished marble. "It's over, Elisa," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that mixed relief and a paternal sadness. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "You did it." Elisa looked up at him, and for the first time that night allowed a spark of her true feelings to show. "We did it, sir," she corrected softly. "You trusted me." Arthur's trust was not a new thing. It was a bond forged decades earlier, born from a debt of gratitude that time had only strengthened. Arthur's father, the founder of Sterling Logistics, had given Elisa's father his first job and financed his education. When a sudden illness took her parents, leaving her orphaned and penniless, it was Arthur, already at the helm of the company, sir, who took her in. He saw in her an intelligence and integrity that the world insisted on ignoring because of her humble origins. While Owen received the best education money could buy, Arthur secretly funded Elisa's night school studies. From late literacy to a degree in accounting and finance, he taught her the true meaning of legacy, that it wasn't about assets and holdings, but about a heritage of honesty and hard work. She was his most precious investment, a human treasure hidden in plain sight, disguised in a cleaner's uniform, waiting for the right moment. "I knew my nephew was straying from the path," Arthur confessed, walking to Owen's desk and running his fingers over the scattered financial reports. Greed blinded him. He only saw immediate profit, the return on investments, the stock market quotes. He never understood that the real capital of this company is its people. Elisa approached, looking at the charts and spreadsheets that, to Owen, were just tools for accumulating more wealth. To her, they represented the security and livelihood of thousands of families. And he was moving the money to offshore accounts, converting it to dollars and even cryptocurrency to make it harder to trace, she said, her voice now firm, that of the financial analyst she truly was. The cash flow was being doctored to hide the bleeding. The hole in the company's funds is bigger than we imagined. Arthur nodded, his face grim. The legal battle would be long, the company's recovery even harder. He seemed to have aged 10 years in a few hours. The illness that had taken him to Europe wasn't a complete lie. His heart was weak, and the stress of this operation had pushed him to his limit. He leaned on the desk, his breathing slightly labored. Elisa noticed his fragility and felt a chill of concern. The pillar that had supported her for her entire life was wavering. "I can no longer lead this company as I once did, Elisa," Arthur said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My health won't allow it." He looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. "But Sterling Logistics cannot fall. My father's legacy, the future of our employees. It all depends on what we do next." He straightened up and walked to a large oil painting depicting New York Harbor in the last century. With a precise movement, he shifted it, revealing a safe embedded in the wall. He entered the combination, and the steel door swung open noiselessly. From it, he didn't retrieve gold bars or stacks of cash. He took out an old leather-bound book, a handwritten accounting ledger, and a single, ornate brass key. He turned and extended the objects to Elisa. Her hands trembled as she took them. "This," Arthur said, touching the book, "is the true treasure of Sterling Logistics. The record of every honest deal, every handshake. And this key," he paused, the weight of his next words filling the room, "opens my father's first office, the true heart of this company. Owen never knew it existed. Now, all of this is your responsibility, and tomorrow, in front of the entire board of directors, you will not be cleaning the room. You will be sitting at the table next to me." The descent in the private elevator, the same one she had so often cleaned, was a dizzying journey into a new kind of existence. Elisa felt the weight of the old ledger and the brass key in her bag, objects that seemed to burn through the fabric, marking her with a responsibility that was both an honor and a crushing burden. The lights of New York, which had once been just points of distant beauty seen from the top-floor window, now seemed like curious eyes, witnesses to her secret transformation. A discreet car, sent by Mr. Sterling, was waiting for her. During the drive, she remained silent, watching the city pass by. The luxurious neighborhoods gave way to the more modest and familiar streets of Astoria, Queens, where the smell of jasmine and the faint sound of music from a distant block party welcomed her home. Her apartment was small, but it was her sanctuary, a refuge of simplicity, with inherited furniture, a picture frame with a faded photo of her parents, and the comforting silence she cherished. It was a world light years away from the opulence and betrayal she had left behind in the skyscraper. As she placed the key and the book on the small wooden kitchen table, they seemed like objects from another planet, relics of a life that wasn't hers. The contrast was jarring, the steel and glass of Sterling Logistics against the worn ceramic of her home. She felt a wave of vertigo. Who was she to take on such a role? A lifetime spent in the shadows, perfecting the art of being invisible, had not prepared her for the spotlight of a boardroom. Doubt, a cold poison, began to seep into her mind. She had the technical knowledge, thanks to years of secret study, but the posture, the confidence, the ability to command respect from men who saw her as less than nothing, that was something no book could teach. She felt like an imposter, wearing a costume that was far too big for her. The legacy Arthur had entrusted to her was not just a set of financial assets, it was a legacy of trust she feared she wouldn't be able to honor. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her dark thoughts. It was Mrs. Rossi, her neighbor in her 70s, a kind soul with eyes that saw more than most. "I made some chamomile tea. Dear, I saw the light on and figured you had a long night," she said, holding out a steaming mug. Elisa forced a smile, accepting the gesture of kindness. "I did, Mrs. Rossi. A lot of work." The old woman watched her closely. "You look different, Elisa. There's a storm behind those calm eyes of yours." Elisa looked away, feeling the weight of the secret. How could she explain that the cleaning lady sharing tea with her was now the guardian of a multi-million-dollar empire? "Just worries. Work stuff." Mrs. Rossi squeezed her hand. "Whatever it is, remember who you are. Strength isn't in the title you hold, but in the heart you have." The simple words of that woman, spoken with a lifetime of wisdom, hit Elisa harder than any business speech. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Elisa spent the hours awake, leafing through the old accounting ledger. Every page was a testament to the founder's character. Notes in the margins spoke not just of profit and dividends, but of respect for employees, of investments in the community, of a business built on ethics. She wasn't just protecting a cash flow, she was defending a philosophy, By dawn, a new resolve had solidified in her heart. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now accompanied by a sense of purpose. She got up and went to her modest closet. Tucked in the back was a dark grey pantsuit, bought years ago with her savings, a symbol of a nearly forgotten hope. She put it on, standing before the small hallway mirror. She saw a new woman. She was not an arrogant executive, nor an invisible cleaner. She was Elisa, and for the first time she felt that might be enough. With the book and key in hand, she opened the door to face the hardest day of her life, not knowing if the board of directors would eat her alive or bow to the woman she had become. Crossing the lobby of Sterling Logistics was the first trial by fire. The same security guard who, for years, had greeted her with a distracted nod, now stared with open-mouthed confusion, his brain trying to reconcile the image of the cleaning lady with the impeccable pantsuit and erect posture. The receptionist, who barely looked up from her computer when she passed with her cart, now stood up, stammering a "Good morning, Ms. Elisa." Every step toward the private elevator was a small victory against invisibility. She was no longer part of the furniture. She was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit the corporate puzzle, and the bewildered stares followed her like a spotlight. On the top floor, Mr. Sterling was waiting for her in the boardroom antechamber. The fragility of the previous night had been replaced by a mask of determination, though Elisa could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "They're all in there," he said in a low voice. "Remember what we talked about. You don't have to prove anything to them. Just be yourself. Your knowledge is your armor." He gave her a firm handshake, a gesture that transferred a bit of his strength to her. When the two of them entered the boardroom, the silence was immediate and absolute. It was a chamber of power, with a long mahogany table surrounded by 12 leather chairs, most occupied by men in dark suits and graying hair. They were the pillars of the financial market, figures whose names graced business columns. Their faces turned in unison, first to Arthur with visible relief, and then to Elisa with a wave of shock and disbelief that was almost palpable. Whispers spread like wildfire. One of the directors, a man with a prominent chin and cold eyes named Vance, stood up. He was known for his sharp mind and his complete lack of patience for what he considered sentimentality. "Arthur, thank God you're back. We're on the brink of collapse. With Owen and Frank's arrest, our assets are at risk. Market confidence has plummeted. We need firm leadership. But with all due respect, what is the cleaning lady doing here?" The word "cleaning lady" was said with a cruel emphasis, designed to humiliate and disqualify. Elisa felt the blood rush to her face, but she remembered Mrs. Rossi's and Arthur's words. She took a deep breath, channeling her fear into focus. Before Arthur could respond, she stepped forward, placing the old leather satchel on the polished table. With all due respect, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear, "the greatest risk to the company's assets isn't the arrest of those responsible, but the extent of the hole they left behind. A hole that, according to my preliminary calculations, has severely compromised our net worth, far beyond what the doctored reports suggest." The room fell into a stunned silence. Vance stared at her, caught off guard by her audacity and technical jargon. "Your calculations," he scoffed. "What calculations could you possibly make?" Elisa opened the satchel and, with the precision of a surgeon, took out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table to him. "The calculations of someone who had access to the actual servers and cash flow, not the reports you all approved without question." Vance's face went from red with anger to white with shock as his eyes scanned the numbers. It was a devastatingly precise analysis of the fraud, detailing the transfers, the hidden liabilities, and the company's true financial situation. He looked up at her, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of fear. Who was this woman? Arthur, sensing the battle had only just begun, intervened. "Gentlemen, Elisa is not here to be questioned. She is here to guide us out of this crisis. Owen and Frank believed this company's wealth was in Swiss bank accounts or stock market investments. They were wrong. He paused dramatically, looking at each board member. The true fortune of Sterling Logistics, our real treasure, has never been in the accounting books, you know. And the only person in this room who holds the key to access it, he concluded, pointing to the small brass key Elisa now held in her hand, is her. Arthur's declaration hung in the air, dense and incomprehensible. The brass key in Elisa's hand seemed to radiate a heat that burned her palm. The board of directors, a collective of minds accustomed to the coldness of numbers and the relentless logic of markets, was completely disarmed. They looked from the key to Elisa's face and back to Arthur, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. It was Vance, recovering from the shock with a surge of indignation, who broke the spell. He slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. "Arthur, this is absurd. It's madness. Your illness has affected your judgment," he bellowed, his face red. "We're talking about the survival of a multi-million-dollar business, of a legacy built over generations. Our stock is in freefall. We need a crisis manager, a big name, not riddles and fairy tales." He turned to Elisa, the contempt in his voice a sharp weapon. "What does this woman know about derivatives, hedge funds, negotiating with international creditors in euros and dollars? Is she going to calm investors with a bucket and a mop?" Vance's aggression opened the floodgates for others to voice their own misgivings. An older, soft-spoken director named Miller intervened with a more conciliatory, yet equally skeptical tone. "Mr. Sterling, please understand our position. Confidence is our most valuable asset right now. The market needs a sign of stability. Presenting Miss Morales as our savior, with all due respect, would be a public relations disaster. It would be perceived as panic and desperation. Our profitability, which is already compromised, would hit zero." Heads around the room nodded in agreement. They weren't necessarily bad men, but they were pragmatic. In their world, image was everything, and the image of a cleaning lady in command was a recipe for bankruptcy. Elisa felt the weight of every word, every doubtful glance. They were like stones being thrown at her. A part of her, the part that had lived in the shadows for so long, wanted to retreat, to disappear, to hand over the key and return to the safe anonymity of her uniform. Doubt was a snake coiling in her stomach. They were right. She was a nobody. But then she looked at the old ledger on the table. She remembered the founder's notes, Mrs. Rossi's words about the strength of the heart, and Arthur's look of unwavering trust. She wasn't here to be an executive like them. She was here to be something different. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. "You are all correct," she began, and the ensuing silence was one of pure surprise. "My name means nothing to the financial market. My face isn't on the cover of business magazines. I don't have a network of contacts in Davos or on Wall Street." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But the crisis we're in wasn't created by a lack of technical expertise or influential contacts. It was created by a lack of character, by greed that put profit above people." She touched the leather cover of the book. "This company's capital, the real capital, isn't in stock charts or dividend reports. It's here, in the story of how it was built." Elisa stood, holding the brass key firmly. Her hesitation had transformed into a calm, resolute authority. "Mr. Sterling spoke of the true treasure of Sterling Logistics, and for us to reclaim our future, to have something solid to present to investors and employees, we must first remember who we are. We must go back to the source." With a determination that left everyone in the room paralyzed, she walked to one of the walls of the boardroom, a wall everyone had always assumed was just a decorative dark wood panel. "Please, follow me." Hesitantly, moved by a curiosity that outweighed their distrust, the directors rose one by one. Even Vance, with an expression of bitter skepticism, followed the group. Elisa led them out of the boardroom, down a short, unadorned hallway no one had ever noticed. At the end of it was a simple, solid wood door, with no plaque, no identification. It looked like the door to a supply closet, or perhaps a dead file archive. Elisa inserted the old brass key into the lock. The sound of the mechanism turning, heavy and creaking from disuse, echoed in the tense silence. She pushed the door, which opened into darkness, releasing a smell of old paper and dust. She flicked a switch, and the dim light revealed something no one expected. The warm, yellowed light that flickered on revealed not a dusty storeroom, but a secret chamber that took everyone's breath away. The place looked like a cross between an old library and a treasure vault. Hand-carved dark wood shelves ran from floor to ceiling, filled not with archive boxes, but with thousands of leather-bound ledgers, each with a polished brass label bearing a family name and a date. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and, strangely, of hope. In the center of the room, a large bronze globe rested on an oak table, and the walls were adorned with old maps and sepia photographs of men and women working on docks, in offices, and in warehouses. It was a sanctuary, a museum dedicated not to products or profits, but to people. The directors entered hesitantly, their expensive shoes making a muffled sound on the wooden floorboards. The skepticism on their faces gave way to a confused awe. "What is this place?" whispered Miller, the older director. Elisa walked to the center of the room with a reverent familiarity. She ran her fingers over the globe before turning to them. "This," she said, her voice echoing softly in the silence, "is the true treasury of Sterling Logistics. Arthur Sterling Sr. believed that a company's greatest capital was not in its assets, its stock, or its cash flow. It was in its people." She approached one of the shelves and pulled out a ledger. "Each of these volumes doesn't record business transactions. It records investments in human lives." She opened the book, revealing elegant cursive. "This is not a record of liabilities. It's the story of the Silver family, whose patriarch received an advance to build his house in 1952. And here," she pointed to a note in the margin, "is the interest he paid. Loyalty and 40 years of impeccable service." She returned the book to its place and continued, her passion transforming the once invisible woman into a charismatic leader. "The fortune of this company was built on the idea that the best investment you can make is in human dignity. Every loan for a medical emergency, every scholarship for an employee's child, every bit of help for a local small business, it's all recorded here." Vance, though visibly shaken by the magnificence of the place, tried to compose himself. "This is philanthropy. It's noble. But it doesn't pay the salaries at the end of the month. It doesn't calm the markets." Elisa looked at him, but not with defiance. There was a compassion in her eyes that disarmed him. "You're mistaken, Mr. Vance. This is the most intelligent business strategy that has ever existed. It generates a type of wealth that cannot be bought, trust. It generates an asset of loyalty that survives any stock market crash." She began to walk slowly along one of the shelves, as if searching for something specific. The others followed her with their eyes, caught in her spell. "There are investments whose returns are not measured in dollars, but in generations." She stopped, her fingers hovering over a dark green leather spine, a little more worn than the others. With infinite care, she removed the volume from the shelf. She turned and walked toward Vance, who took an instinctive step back. Elisa opened the book to a page marked with a silk ribbon. A single, yellowed photograph was attached with a metal clip, the image of a thin young man, his eyes frightened but full of dreams, standing in front of a small carpentry workshop. "I believe you recognize this man," Elisa said, her voice as soft as a whisper. Vance's jaw dropped. His arrogant eyes widened in shock and vulnerability. The color drained from his face. leaving him pale as a ghost. That's my father," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Elisa then read the note below the picture. Anthony Vance. Emergency loan granted in 1968 for the purchase of tools to reopen his workshop after a fire. Founder's note. A man of great potential and integrity, our riskiest investment, and perhaps the one with the greatest future return. The room fell into an absolute silence, broken only by Vance's trembling breath. The architect of his own fortune, the man who had ridiculed the cleaning lady, was now confronted with the irrefutable proof that the foundation of his entire legacy, of his entire life, had been built on an act of faith and humanity from the very company he now helped lead. Richard Vance's world, a universe built on the premise that weakness was a sin and emotion a liability, collapsed in a dusty, silent instant. The photograph of his father, young and helpless, was a mirror reflecting not the past, but his own soul, stripping bare the arrogance he wore as armor. The story he told himself, that of the self-made man, the multimillionaire who triumphed through the sheer force of his business genius, was revealed to be a fiction. He was the heir to an act of compassion, the beneficiary of a type of investment he had spent his entire life scorning. His hands, which signed multi-million-dollar stock orders without a tremor, now shook uncontrollably. He felt the eyes of the other directors on him, not with contempt, but with a shocked pity that was somehow even more unbearable. He was a titan of the financial market reduced to a boy, confronted with the unpayable debt of gratitude. Elisa saw the exposed fracture in the man's soul. She could have used that moment to seal her authority, to humiliate her greatest opponent and consolidate her power. But the strength that guided her came not from domination, but from empathy. With a gesture of almost maternal gentleness, she closed the heavy leather book, the muffled sound seeming to end a painful chapter. Without a word, she returned it to its place on the shelf, the gesture signifying, "Your secret is safe. Your history is honored." That act of kindness was more devastating to Vance than any accusation. It was a mercy blow that shattered what was left of his composure. He took a step back, shaking his head, unable to form a word. He turned abruptly and fled the secret room, his hurried footsteps echoing down the hall, the sound of a man running from himself. The silence he left behind was filled with a new understanding. The remaining directors looked at Elisa differently. Disbelief had turned to respect, and skepticism to admiration. Miller, the oldest director, approached the shelf and touched the spine of one of the books, as if touching a sacred relic. "My God," he whispered. "We've been sitting on a gold mine and didn't even know it." Arthur, who had watched everything in silence, finally spoke, his voice full of a serene pride. "This, gentlemen, is our true net worth. The wealth that does not depreciate, the capital that no economic crisis can erode." Elisa felt a small measure of relief, the first wave of acceptance, but she knew the emotional battle was merely the prelude to a much more pragmatic war. She turned to the group, her face serious, but her eyes shining with a new confidence. "The loyalty and trust stored in this room are the foundations upon which we will rebuild Sterling Logistics," she said, her voice firm. "This will be our argument for our employees, for the press and for the market. We will show them that our strength lies not in profit projections, but in our character." The men nodded, a new hope beginning to dawn on their tired faces. They finally had a narrative, a powerful story that could overcome the scandal of the fraud. But the reality of the outside world soon invaded their sanctuary. It was Miller who brought the bad news, his face suddenly pale as he looked at his phone screen. "Elisa, Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice tense. "I've just received an urgent email. The consortium of European banks, our biggest creditors, has moved up the meeting. They're panicking over Owen's arrest. They're demanding an emergency conference call with the company's leadership to re-evaluate our dollar credit line. The call is in 1 hour." He swallowed hard, looking at Elisa. And they demand to speak with the person who is, effectively, in command. 1 hour, 60 minutes to prepare a defense that would determine the survival or bankruptcy of an empire. The news landed like a bomb in the treasury room, shattering the moment of revelation and unity. Panic was an electric current running through the directors. They moved in a frenzy of urgency, returning to the boardroom, which had now become a crisis command center. Papers were scattered, phones were dialed, voices overlapped in a chorus of anxiety. Elisa, however, remained still for a moment in the silent sanctuary, feeling the stark contrast between the warmth of the old wood and the cold, metallic challenge that awaited her. The battle she had just won was about the company's past and soul. The one to come was about the brutal present and the merciless language of money. These were European bankers. They would not be moved by leather-bound books and stories of kindness. They wanted numbers, guarantees, a contingency plan to protect the capital they had invested. When she entered the conference room, the atmosphere was glacial. It was a room designed for intimidation, a long black glass table, minimalist chairs, and an entire wall that was a high-definition screen, still dark. Mr. Sterling was already seated, an untouched glass of water before him. His breathing was a little heavier, and the tension was clearly taking its toll. Miller and the other directors positioned themselves behind him, like soldiers bracing for impact. There was an empty seat at the head of the table, facing the screen, the seat of command. Everyone looked at her. For a moment, the old Elisa, the cleaning lady, screamed inside. Who was she to sit there, to speak for billions of dollars? Owen's voice echoed in her mind, cruel and mocking. Don't interrupt the adults' conversation. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and walked to the chair. As she sat, the door opened silently. Richard Vance walked in. He said nothing. His eyes, devoid of their former arrogance, met hers for a second, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then he went to the corner of the room and stood, watching. That small gesture of support from her greatest adversary was the armor she didn't know she needed. The giant screen flickered to life, revealing 3 faces in 3 different cities. They were middle-aged men with severe expressions and impeccable suits, framed by windows overlooking the financial districts of Zurich, Paris, and Frankfurt. "Mr. Sterling," said the man in the center, a Swiss banker named Herr Schmidt, his voice precise and emotionless. "We are sorry about your health, but this situation is intolerable. We demand to know who is in charge and what the plan is to secure our investments." Arthur leaned toward the microphone. "Herr Schmidt, gentlemen, the leadership of Sterling Logistics is in safe hands." He gestured toward Elisa. "The person in charge is Ms. Elisa." He hesitated, realizing he'd never known her last name. Elisa leaned forward, her voice steady. "Elisa Morales, and I am in charge." The bankers glanced at each other, their surprise and disdain barely concealed. "Miss Morales," said the Frenchman, Dubois, "your name is not familiar to us. What is your experience in asset management and debt restructuring?" The question was a knife, designed to make her bleed. Elisa's heart hammered. She didn't have the experience they demanded, but she had the truth. "In my experience, gentlemen, is with this company's most valuable asset, an asset not listed on the balance sheets you've received." She remembered her strategy, to translate soul into numbers. "You speak of securing your investments. I tell you that the greatest risk to your capital was not the fraud, but the philosophy that allowed it. A philosophy that ignored our main pillar of sustainability." Herr Schmidt frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Madame," Elisa leaned forward, her eyes locked on the camera, speaking not just to them, but to the company's future. "I'm talking about a human capital built over 70 years, an employee and partner loyalty that translates to low operational risk, high productivity, and a reputation that I once revealed will be more valuable than any marketing campaign. What Owen and Frank tried to steal was money. What they couldn't touch is our true fortune. And it is with that fortune that I guarantee not only the repayment of our debt, but future profitability based on a more solid and ethical business model. There was a silence on the line. The bankers were intrigued, perhaps even a little impressed by her audacity, but their world was made of facts, not philosophies. Herr Schmidt leaned into the camera, his eyes as cold as alpine ice. A very touching philosophy, Miss Morales. But loyalty does not appear on a balance sheet. Show us the numbers. What is the verifiable net worth of this company right now, accounting for the full extent of the fraud? Herr Schmidt's question was a spear of ice, designed to pierce the poetry and expose the cold, hard wound of the numbers. Show us the numbers. In that moment, all the stories of loyalty and all the leather-bound books seemed to evaporate, leaving Elisa exposed under the harsh light of financial reality. The air in the room grew thin. The future of Sterling Logistics, the livelihood of thousands of families, the legacy of generations, it all came down to this single answer. Elisa felt the weight of everyone's gaze, a physical pressure that threatened to crush her. She didn't have a final number. It was impossible. The fraud was a complex web of transactions involving cryptocurrency and tax havens, designed to be a nightmare to trace. To give an inaccurate number would be professional suicide. To admit she didn't know would be a confession of incompetence. She took a deep breath, not to find courage, but to find the center of her knowledge. The cleaning lady retreated, and the financial analyst took control. "Mr. Schmidt, your question is the most important one," she began, her voice calm and methodical, devoid of any defensive emotion. "And the honest answer is that an exact, audited number for our net worth, at this moment, is impossible to provide. Anyone who told you otherwise would be lying." The bankers stirred, but Elisa held up a hand. "However, I can give you something far more valuable. The methodology we're using to determine the full extent of the damage, and, more importantly, our plan to stop the bleeding and rebuild our assets." She stood and walked to a digital whiteboard on the wall, picking up a stylus. With quick, precise movements, she began to draw a flowchart. Owen and Frank didn't just siphon funds, they created a parasitic system. The first step was to inflate liabilities with ghost suppliers. The second, to divert cash flow to shell accounts where the money was converted into Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to be scattered. She listed the challenges: blockchain tracing, international legal cooperation, the volatility of digital assets. Her handwriting was steady, her jargon impeccable. She was no longer speaking philosophy, she was speaking their language. "Our initial estimate points to a 30 to 40% reduction in our liquid assets. It's a devastating blow. The raw numbers put us in a position of technical insolvency." She paused, letting the harshness of those words sink in. Then she turned to them, her eyes burning with intensity. "But that is the assessment that only considers the traditional balance sheet. Now, allow me to introduce you to an asset that has not been compromised, an asset that has in fact become our greatest collateral." She drew a large circle in the center of the board. Inside it, she wrote, "Trust Capital." "What you call philanthropy," she said, remembering Vance's words, "we call a long-term investment with a guaranteed return. We have 70 years of data proving that our policy of supporting employees and communities has generated an ecosystem of loyalty that we are now going to monetize." It was at that moment that Vance, who had remained silent in the corner, stepped forward. Everyone turned to him. His voice was that of the market shark they all knew, cold and analytical. "Herr Schmidt, Dubois, it's Richard Vance. You know my reputation. I don't invest in feelings." He stood beside Elisa, an unlikely ally. "I've spent the last hour analyzing Miss Morales's premise from a purely mathematical point of view, and while the terms she uses are unorthodox, the logic is sound. What she calls trust capital, I call the most powerful risk mitigation tool I've ever seen. It's an insurance policy against collapse, which is why I am announcing that I will personally inject my own capital to cover a portion of the immediate liquidity, using my shares as collateral. I am betting on her leadership. The shock on the conference call was total. Vance's endorsement was an earthquake. He was one of them. He was a predator, and he was defending the prey. Herr Schmidt was speechless for a moment, his eyes blinking. He looked at Elisa, then at Vance, his mind clearly spinning, trying to process this unbelievable turn of events. Finally, he composed himself, his face an impenetrable mask. Ms. Morales, Mr. Vance, your proposal is deeply irregular. The consortium must deliberate on this new development. He paused, and his final words fell like a guillotine. We will give you our answer in 24 hours, and that answer will be final. The screen went black. The black screen was an abyss, a vacuum that sucked all the sound and energy from the room. For a long, tense second, no one moved. It was as if the collective breath of the Sterling Logistics Board of Directors was on hold, suspended by the promise of a verdict that would come in 24 hours. Then the spell broke. Miller let out a shaky sigh that turned into a nervous laugh. My God, Elisa, I've never seen anything like it. The other directors surrounded her, hands outstretched, their voices a murmur of admiration and relief. There were compliments on her courage, her intelligence, her command of the facts. But to Elisa, the words were a distant hum. Her mind was focused on two things: the fragility of Mr. Sterling, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair, and the still figure of Richard Vance. When the crowd dispersed a little, he approached. The contempt in his eyes had been replaced by something complex, a mixture of respect and self-assessment. What you did, he began, his voice hoarse, was the boldest business maneuver I have ever witnessed. He paused, searching for the words. I didn't endorse a philosophy, Morales. I endorsed a strategy. You took an intangible asset, our legacy, and turned it into real collateral. That's not sentimentality, it's genius. My capital is safe with you. He didn't smile. It wasn't his style, but he held out his hand. When Elisa shook it, the gesture sealed not a truce, but an alliance forged in fire. The next hours crawled by with torturous slowness. The company was a giant waiting room. Rumors spread through the floors in whispers, but the leadership remained entrenched in the executive suite, waiting. Elisa found Mr. Sterling in his private office, watching the city. He seemed to have aged more in that last hour than in the past 10 years. You were magnificent, he said. Without turning, you became the leader I always knew you were. I only showed them what you and your father built, she replied, coming closer. He turned, and the vulnerability on his face hit her like a blow. Elisa, I need to tell you, the doctors have given me less time than I let on. This fight, it's my last one. The air left Elisa's lungs. The battle for the company suddenly became something much deeper, much more desperate. It was a race against time on two fronts. Don't say that, sir, she whispered. He smiled, a sad but serene smile. It's all right. Watching you take your place is the best investment I ever made. It secured the only return that matters. He took her hand and squeezed it with what little strength he had left. It doesn't matter what the bankers decide tomorrow. The future of Sterling Logistics is you. Elisa spent most of the night awake, not in the boardroom, but in the comforting silence of the treasury room. She walked among the shelves, touching the spines of the books, reading the names of the families, feeling the weight of those lives on her shoulders. These books were not just records of debts and payments. They were proof that a business could have a soul. The company's fortune lay not in the number of ships or warehouses, but in the invisible web of gratitude and respect that connected all those stories. She was not just fighting for a logistics conglomerate, she was fighting for that idea. At dawn, the tension on the top floor was almost unbearable. The directors gathered again in the conference room, their faces pale and drawn from a sleepless night. No one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a wall clock, each second a hammer blow. Elisa sat at the head of the table, the same place where she had faced the bankers. On the black glass surface, the conference phone looked like a sleeping animal, sinister in its stillness. The 24 hours were up. At any moment, it could ring. And then, in the deafening silence, the phone's shrill, sharp ring cut through the air, making everyone jump in their seats. The ringing phone was a blade of sound slicing through the silence. For an instant, everyone in the room became a statue, frozen in the same pose of anxiety. Elisa looked at the device, and in that piece of black plastic, she saw the portal to two possible futures, salvation or the abyss. Her eyes met Mr. Sterling's, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a final act of transferring power. With a steady hand, Elisa pressed the speakerphone button. A faint static filled the room, followed by the unmistakable, glacial voice of Herr Schmidt, Miss Morales, gentlemen. There was no hint of emotion in his tone. He was a banker, and his voice was the embodiment of capital itself, impersonal, pragmatic, and ruthless. The consortium has deliberated extensively on the situation at Sterling Logistics. He paused for an eternity. We have analyzed the numbers from the fraud, the exposed liabilities, and the severe erosion of your net worth. The risk assessment, by any conventional metric, is unacceptable. Each word was a nail in the company's coffin. Elisa felt the directors behind her shrink. She could hear Miller's heavy breathing, the sound of Vance discreetly tapping his fingers on his leg. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead, focusing all her strength on not letting hope drain away. However, Schmidt continued, and the word hung in the air, loaded with cruel potential, we also considered the arguments presented. Mr. Vance's personal capital injection was a significant factor. And your thesis on trust capital, Miss Morales, generated an unprecedented debate within our committee. Another pause. We debated the nature of true wealth, whether it can be measured in dollars and euros alone, or if there are intangible assets that, in times of crisis, become the most solid collateral of all. It was torture. He was dissecting their soul over a conference call, holding their fate in his hands, relishing the power he held over them. The board's vote was clear, Schmidt said, his tone now final. The majority voted against extending the line of credit. The risk to our investors was deemed too great. A muffled sob escaped one of the directors. Mr. Sterling closed his eyes, his face a mask of resigned pain, his father's dream, his life's work, the legacy he had tried to protect. It was all turning to dust. Elisa felt a deep cold spread through her chest, but along with the pain, a strange calm washed over her, the calm of someone with nothing left to lose. She leaned toward the microphone, not to plead, but to end the chapter with dignity. I understand your decision, Herr Schmidt. I thank you for your time. But before she could hang up, the banker's voice cut her off, now with a different timbre, something almost human. I wasn't finished. Ms. Morales. The silence returned, but this time it was electric, filled with a new, incomprehensible possibility. The board voted against it, Schmidt repeated. However, our consortium's bylaws grant me, as chairman, a rare veto authority in extraordinary circumstances, and I deemed this an extraordinary circumstance. Eyes around the room widened, hope, which had seemed dead, flickered, daring to revive. After your presentation, I ordered a deep search of our archives, looking for any precedent of loyalty investments. We found none. But we found something else. He paused a final time, and this time his voice was thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "We found the record of a small loan made in 1949 to a young German immigrant at the port of New York who had lost everything in the war, an interest-free loan, guaranteed only by his word. The name of the lending company was Sterling and Sons. That immigrant was my grandfather." The revelation landed in the room with the force of a lightning strike. Their fate wasn't being decided on a spreadsheet, but on an old page in a leather-bound book. "Therefore, I will be using my veto," Schmidt said, his voice firm. "The consortium will fully guarantee the capital necessary for the recovery of Sterling Logistics. The money is secured." A wave of euphoria and relief swept the room. Tears streamed down the faces of the toughest men, but Schmidt raised his voice, cutting through the celebration, "On one condition, and it is non-negotiable." The euphoria in the room died as quickly as it had been born, replaced by an apprehensive silence. The word "condition" sounded like the click of a trap being set. What more could the bankers demand? Controlling shares, exorbitant interest rates, the sale of valuable assets. Elisa felt the tension return, a tight knot in her stomach. She braced for the final blow, the predatory clause that would turn the rescue into a hostile takeover. "And what is the condition, Herr Schmidt?" she asked, her voice an oasis of calm in the desert of anxiety. The Swiss banker's answer was not what anyone expected. It wasn't about money, collateral, or power. It was about something much deeper. "The condition, Ms. Morales," Schmidt said, and for the first time, his voice held an unmistakable tone of admiration, "is that you remain in command. The leadership of Sterling Logistics must be, permanently and officially, yours. My grandfather received an investment based on character. Our consortium, today, will do the same. We are not investing in a company. We are investing in you." The shock in the room was absolute, but this time it was a shock of pure, dumbfounded joy. The condition was not a punishment, it was a coronation. The greatest vote of confidence they could receive wasn't in the promised millions of dollars, but in those words. Elisa was breathless. The cleaning lady, the invisible woman, the secret financial analyst, had just been appointed CEO by one of the most powerful banking consortiums in the world. She looked at Mr. Sterling. Silent tears streamed down the old patriarch's wrinkled face, but he was smiling. It was the smile of a man who sees his most precious legacy finally safe. The call ended, and the boardroom erupted. Directors hugged, laughed, and cried with relief. Vance, the man of ice, approached Elisa, and in his eyes was an emotion he probably hadn't felt in decades. "I told you it was genius," he said, with a genuine smile. "Congratulations, Madam CEO." In the days that followed, a new energy swept through the skyscraper. The news of the fraud and the subsequent salvation spread like wildfire. But the narrative that dominated was not one of scandal, but of the incredible rise of Elisa Morales. She became a symbol of hope and integrity. Under her leadership, Sterling Logistics began to transform. The treasury room was open to employees, not as an archive, but as the beating heart of the new company culture. The story of each family recorded there became part of every new hire's training. Trust capital ceased to be a theory and became the official metric of success, alongside profit and profitability. Elisa implemented profit-sharing programs, increased investment in scholarships, and created an employee emergency fund, formalizing the practices the founder had started on instinct. The company didn't just survive, it was reborn, stronger and with a clearer purpose than ever before. Owen and Frank, stripped of their wealth and power, faced justice. Their names, once synonymous with success and business acumen, became a cautionary tale about arrogance and greed. Their assets were frozen, and after a long legal process, Much of the embezzled fortune was traced and recovered, thanks to Elisa's expertise in digital finance. Justice, like the company's rescue, was a methodical, quiet, and relentless process. Elisa took no pleasure in their downfall, only the sad confirmation that true poverty is not the lack of money, but the absence of character. Mr. Sterling lived long enough to see the seed of his faith come into full bloom. He passed away peacefully a few months later, in his sleep, with a smile on his face. In his will, he didn't leave Elisa stock or money. He left her his father's old accounting ledger and the brass key, the symbols of the true power he had taught her to wield. His inheritance to her was not of wealth, but of responsibility, and it was the most valuable gift she had ever received. 5 years later, the afternoon sun streamed through the same panoramic window of the Sterling Logistics executive suite, but the light seemed different. It was warmer, softer. The office, once a mausoleum of mahogany and arrogance, was now a living space with plants, photographs of smiling teams, and a detailed model of a company-funded community center. Elisa Morales, sitting in the chair that once represented oppressive power, reviewed a report. Her pantsuit was elegant, but the woman wearing it still had the eyes of someone who saw the soul of things. The company was a behemoth. Under her management, profit and profitability had exceeded all expectations, and its stock was a model of stability and ethical growth. But for Elisa, these were just byproducts. True success lay elsewhere. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her concentration. "Come in, Mariana." A young woman in her early 20s, her eyes bright with intelligence, entered with a tablet in her hand. "Ms. Morales, the warehouse expansion project has been approved, and the cash flow projection is even better than we expected." Elisa smiled. Mariana was the first recipient of the Arthur Sterling Legacy Fund, a full scholarship for the children of employees. She had graduated with honors in economics and was now one of the company's most promising analysts. "That's wonderful, Mariana. But tell me, how is your mother?" The young woman beamed, a genuine smile of gratitude. "She's doing well, so proud. She says the real inheritance she'll leave me is the education Sterling Logistics gave me." Elisa's heart warmed. This was it. This was where true wealth was made manifest. "It's the best investment we could make," she said. "Keep up the good work." When the young woman left, Elisa stood and walked to the window. New York City stretched out below, vast and magnificent. The same view Owen had once used to feel like a god. But Elisa didn't see a kingdom at her feet. She saw a web of lives, of stories, of struggles and dreams, interconnected in ways that financial statements could never capture. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from invisibility to leadership, from fear to conviction. The greatest lesson she had learned was that true fortune is not accumulated, but shared. She turned and walked to a corner of the office where, on a wooden pedestal, rested a new leather-bound book, identical to those in the Treasury Room. It was the first volume of the new era. With a fountain pen, she opened it to a blank page and began to write. Mariana Garcia, daughter of staff member Lucia Garcia, investment, full scholarship, interest, talent, dedication, and the perpetuation of our values, return on capital, unlimited. She closed the book with a feeling of deep peace. The cycle continued. The legacy was alive. The company was no longer just a business. It was a guardian of futures. Looking out the window again, she didn't feel the weight of power, but the lightness of purpose. She knew challenges would come, that the business world was ruthless, but the foundation upon which Sterling Logistics was now rebuilt was unshakable, for it was made not of money, but of human dignity.